Welcome to the History Maps podcast.
So, if you were to trace the laws that protect your fundamental human rights today back to their absolute origin, you might expect to find some quiet room full of philosophers.
Right, like guys debating high ideals.
Yeah, but you would actually find a muddy, bloody encampment where desperate warlords were basically holding a tyrant at sword point.
Today we are taking a really comprehensive deep dive into the historical records covering the First Barons' War.
Which is this huge conflict that consumed England between 1215 and 1217.
And our mission here is to unpack how a feudal dispute over land and taxes just, cascaded into a full-blown civil war.
Right, and it invited this largely forgotten French invasion and ultimately cemented the Magna Carta into the bedrock of modern legal thought.
We are going to explore the surviving documents, the chronicles, the royal writs, just to understand the precise timeline.
And, look at the key figures who drove the conflict and the enduring legacy they left behind.
And this matters profoundly for you, the listener, because the fundamental concepts that protect your rights today, the ideas of due process, proportional punishment, those were flinched here.
Yeah, the whole idea of the sovereign being subject to the law, those concepts were hammered out by desperate people just trying to survive a completely volatile political landscape.
Let us begin by looking at the catalyst for all this chaos, which is King John.
Right, so John was the youngest son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine.
He inherited this vast empire, right, the Angevin Empire.
He did. It stretched from the borders of Scotland all the way down to the Pyrenees. But the historical record shows that in 1204, John suffered a catastrophic military failure.
He loses the vital continental territories, right? Normandy and Anjou.
Yes, to King Philip II of France. And that loss in 1204, that is the critical inflection point for everything that follows.
Because the Angevin Empire, which his father had so carefully built up, just fractures.
It does. And for John, losing Normandy was not just a blow to his prestige. It was a devastating financial hit.
Because he loses the tax revenues from those lands.
Right, the agricultural wealth, the military service of the knights who held estates there, all of it, gone.
So he becomes entirely consumed with winning those territories back.
Okay. And to fund the military campaigns required to cross the Channel and fight King Philip, well, John turned his attention inward.
Toward his own English barons.
Yes, and he unleashed a system of crushing taxation and extortion.
I want to look closely at these administrative tactics because they are genuinely ruthless.
Oh, they are. John was not just raising standard taxes, he manipulated the feudal system itself.
Like the sources say, he extorted huge fines from widows who were simply trying to claim their rightful property entitlements.
Yeah, and he charged exorbitant fees for heirs just to enter into their inheritances.
And if he was suspicious of a baron's loyalty, he would demand that the baron hand over his own sons.
As hostages, yeah. Just to ensure good behavior.
Which is wild.
We have to understand how the feudal system was supposed to function, right? It relied on a delicate balance of reciprocal obligations.
Protection and land in exchange for loyalty and service.
Right. The king provided protection and granted land, called a fief. And the barons provided military service, loyalty, and customary financial dues.
But John weaponized those royal prerogatives.
It really did. The records indicate John did a lively business in selling the privilege for widows to remain single.
Or even just to choose who they wish to remarry.
Exactly, or to keep control of their minor children. Under feudal law, the king had the right of wardship over minor heirs.
Meaning he could take the profits of an estate until the heir came of age.
Right, and John abused this right systematically, just draining estates dry.
Listening to this, John does not sound like a traditional medieval king.
No, he doesn't.
He sounds like a mob boss running a protection racket. He is shaking down his own lieutenants.
That is a very apt comparison.
He is demanding exorbitant payouts just to let them keep what they already own, taking their children as collateral, punishing them financially.
Yes, so at what point does a feudal lord's absolute power break the social contract entirely?
That is the precise question the barons were asking.
But the situation was further complicated because the barons themselves were caught between two worlds.
Right. The chronicles provide a detailed window into this through a man named Robert Fitzwalter,
who would eventually become a key leader of the rebellious barons.
So Robert was a powerful English magnate, but his wife, Gunnar de Valon, she held a fief in Normandy.
Specifically at a place called Bourg-en-Bresse.
And when John lost Normandy in 1204, King Philip of France essentially forced the Anglo-Norman aristocracy to choose sides.
Right, you could not serve two masters.
So John seized the English lands of those who sided with the French.
And Philip seized the Norman lands of those who stayed in England. It just split the aristocracy down the middle.
Creating a logistical nightmare for families with holdings on both sides of the channel.
Yet, the records reveal a distinct persistence of cross-channel communication.
Wait, really? Even during the hostilities?
Yeah. In roughly 1208, Robert Fitzwalter actually sent a letter from England to French royal officials in Normandy.
Targeting the Castellan of Arques, right? A man named John de Rouvray.
Right. And a castellan was essentially the governor or military commander of a castle and its surrounding district.
I need to understand the mechanics of this. You have an English baron, Robert Fitzwalter, writing to an enemy official, a French castellan.
In the middle of a Cold War.
Yeah. What was the purpose of this correspondence? How does a letter like that even cross a militarized border?
Well, it speaks to the enduring strength of the church and local economic ties.
Okay.
Robert and his wife Gunnar had previously granted a pension from their lands at Bourg-en-Bresse to the monks of a priory called Notre-Dame-de-Pré.
And after the French annexation of Normandy, 2 local officials tried to take it.
Yeah, the provost of Gournay and his son, they tried to appropriate that pension for themselves, taking advantage of Robert's forced absence.
So Robert's letter to the French castellan was an attempt to protect the monk's pension.
Right. He asked the French official to intervene against other French officials.
And the craziest part is that the French castellan actually honored the request.
He did. He protected the monks.
This paints such a vivid picture of the sheer complexity of the era.
The political fabric at the royal level was tearing, but the personal, religious, and economic ties at the local level were stubbornly holding on.
However, those strained ties, combined with King John's relentless domestic taxation, it just pushed the English barons to their absolute limit.
And the final breaking point arrived in 1214.
Because John had finally amassed enough wealth through his extortion to launch his campaign.
His long-awaited campaign to reclaim his French territories. He formed a broad European coalition, including the Holy Roman Emperor, to attack King Philip.
But the entire enterprise ended in a crushing defeat.
Yes, at the Battle of Bouvines in July 1214.
So John returns to England, having exhausted the kingdom's wealth, alienated his barons, and utterly failed in his military objective.
His aura of authority was just completely shattered.
So he is bankrupt financially and politically.
Right, and the barons, recognizing his extreme vulnerability, they formally rebel.
They seized the city of London in May of 1215.
And by June 15, 1215, John is effectively cornered at a meadow called Runnymede, situated by the River Thames,
where he is forced to place his royal seal on a document drafted by the barons,
known initially as the Articles of the Barons,
which we now call the Magna Carta.
Right. And it is crucial to understand the nature of this document.
Because it wasn't some lofty philosophical treatise on human rights, was it?
Not at all. It was a highly pragmatic, very specific list of demands intended to solve immediate, tangible grievances.
Basically a peace treaty drafted by disgruntled landowners who wanted to protect their wealth.
Yeah, protected from a predatory king.
The text gives us a detailed breakdown of these clauses, and they are intensely practical, like Clause 8.
Right, Clause 8 directly addressed the extortion we discussed earlier regarding women.
It stated that no widow would be compelled to marry so long as she wished to remain without a husband.
It directly curtailed the king's ability to monetize the private lives of noble women.
So he could no longer force a widow to marry one of his loyal supporters just to transfer her lands.
Right, and other clauses dealt with everyday commerce. Clause 35 mandated standardization of measures for wine, ale, and corn.
Specifically the London quarter, right?
Yes, as well as standard widths for dyed, russet, and haberget cloths.
And then there is Clause 33. This one orders the removal of all fish weirs from the Thames, the Medway, and throughout England, except on the seacoast.
Yeah, the fish weirs.
I find this fascinating. We are talking about the foundation of modern constitutional law, and there is an entire clause about fish traps.
It sounds trivial, but it wasn't.
Why are fish weirs important enough to include in a peace treaty with the king?
Well, a fish weir is a stationary trap placed in a river to catch fish. But the mechanism here is purely economic.
How so?
These weirs were often large, sturdy structures of wood and netting that extended far into the river.
Okay, so they were obstructing navigable waterways.
Exactly. In medieval England, rivers like the Thames were the primary highways for heavy trade.
So if the king's supporters or opportunistic lords are building massive fish traps
Huge fish traps, yes.
that block merchant vessels from moving grain, wool, or stone, they are choking the economic lifeblood of the country.
Right. The barons wanted free trade along the rivers to ensure their own economic prosperity.
Now, while those clauses addressed specific economic grievances, clauses 39 and 40 laid down principles that echo loudly today.
Oh, absolutely.
Clause 39 declared that no free man shall be seized, imprisoned, stripped of his rights, outlawed, or exiled, except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land.
And Clause 40 stated simply, "To no one will we sell, to no one deny or delay right or justice."
Those principles establish the bedrock of due process.
They state that the executive power, the king, cannot simply throw someone in a dungeon or seize their property on a whim.
There must be a legal process overseen by peers.
However, the most radical part of the document was the enforcement mechanism.
Found in Clause 61, the security clause.
Right. The barons clearly knew John was entirely untrustworthy, so they built in a consequence for breaking the rules.
Clause 61 established a committee of 25 barons who were granted the legal power to distrain the king.
And distrain is a legal term, meaning to seize property to compel someone to perform an obligation.
So if John violated the charter and failed to correct the issue within 40 days,
These 25 barons had the legal right to seize his castles, lands, and possessions using armed force.
it is a breathtaking concept for the medieval mind.
It really is. The charter created a formalized legal process by which subjects could wage war against their anointed sovereign.
It basically attempted to institutionalize rebellion, providing a legal framework for civil war.
Right, if the king overstepped his bounds.
Now, the number 25 is quite specific.
Yeah, historical analysis suggests there were deeply entrenched layers of meaning behind this number.
In biblical terms, 25 was the age from which Moses permitted the Levites to be consecrated to God's service.
Furthermore, 25 is the square of 5, paralleling the 5 books of the Pentateuch.
And on a purely local, practical level, the Court of Aldermen in the City of London, the governing body, consisted of 25 members.
So the barons were tapping into understood cultural, religious, and civic symbolism to legitimize their authority.
But regardless of the symbolism, the core paradox remains. How can a law legally authorize armed rebellion against the ultimate source of the law?
It fundamentally could not hold. The concept was too extreme for the medieval political order, which viewed the king as ruling by divine right.
So John immediately sent envoys to Rome.
To appeal to Pope Innocent III.
And the Pope, responding to John's appeals, annulled the Magna Carta just months later in August 1215.
The Pope issued a papal bull declaring the charter was extracted by force and fear and was therefore entirely void.
Forbidding the king to observe it and the barons to enforce it.
Right.
Hold on, let me stop you there. Why does the Pope get a veto over English tax law and inheritance disputes?
It's a great question.
I thought this was a domestic dispute between a king and his landlords in England. How does Rome have the authority to void a signed treaty in the English countryside?
That goes back to a brilliant, albeit desperate, political maneuver John made 2 years earlier in 1213.
What did he do?
John had been embroiled in a bitter dispute with the Pope over the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Stephen Langton,
And the Pope had placed England under an interdict.
effectively going on strike, stopping all church services, and even excommunicated John.
So how did John resolve it?
To resolve this, John surrendered the kingdoms of England and Ireland to the Pope and received them back as a papal fief.
Wait, John literally became the Pope's vassal.
Yes. So when the barons forced John to sign the Magna Carta, the Pope viewed this as an attack on his own vassal and his own property.
Innocent III had a vested legal and political interest in protecting John's absolute authority.
Exactly.
So the king has gone rogue, the Pope just burned their peace treaty, and John is gathering a mercenary army.
Right. If you are a rebel baron at this point, you're entirely out of options.
With the treaty in ruins, the Cold War between the king and the barons erupts into open, violent conflict.
The rebel barons make the first major military move.
They seize Rochester Castle to block King John's route from the coast to London.
This sets the stage for one of the most brutal encounters of the war, the Siege of Rochester, which took place from October to November of 1215.
Rochester Castle was a formidable fortress, right? Guarding the crossing of the River Medway.
It was a vital strategic choke point. The rebel barons placed a garrison there under the command of a seasoned warrior named William d'Aubigny.
And King John, marching toward London, realizes he cannot leave this stronghold in his rear.
So he surrounds the castle in early October and demonstrates a terrifying ruthlessness.
The accounts detail how John sacked the nearby Rochester Cathedral, plundering its valuables,
And then deliberately used the sacred space as a stable for his horses.
which was purely a calculated insult to the Archbishop of Canterbury, Stephen Langton, who had been sympathetic to the barons.
Right. John then unleashed an intense bombardment.
He erected 5 heavy siege engines around the castle.
These would have been trebuchets or mangonels capable of hurling heavy stones. They battered the walls day and night.
And by early November, John's forces had breached the outer bailey.
The bailey is the outer walled courtyard of the castle. Once that wall was breached, the defenders were forced to fall back into the massive square stone keep.
The central fortified tower.
Right, and breaching a Norman keep through sheer bombardment was nearly impossible because the walls were incredibly thick.
So John ordered his engineers to dig beneath the foundations.
Yes, and this leads to one of the most visceral sensory details in the entire historical record.
The miners dug a tunnel beneath the southeastern tower of the keep.
To understand this mechanism, the miners would dig a cavity under the stone foundations and prop up the roof of their tunnel with heavy wooden timbers.
Essentially transferring the weight of the stone tower onto the wood.
Right. And on November 25, John set a writ to his justiciars, his chief ministers, with a very specific, bizarre demand.
He ordered them to send him, quote, with all speed by day and night, 40 of the fattest pigs of the sort least good for eating.
The intention was purely incendiary. The slaughterers rendered the fat from those 40 pigs and packed it tightly around the wooden procks inside the mine under the tower.
Because animal fat, especially pig fat, is highly combustible and burns at a very high temperature.
Yeah, and when they set it alight, the intense grease-fueled fire burned through the timbers rapidly.
And without the wooden supports, the earth gave way, and the entire southeastern corner of the enormous stone keep collapsed.
In a roar of dust and rubble.
But even after an entire corner of their fortress collapsed, leaving them exposed to the elements and the enemy, the defenders did not immediately surrender.
No, they retreated behind an internal cross wall within the keep.
The Norman architects had built a dividing wall straight through the middle of the keep specifically for this kind of disaster.
The rebels continued to fight through the breach. It was not until November 30, when they were completely out of food, eating horse meat, and facing starvation, that the garrison finally surrendered.
And after such a costly siege, John was furious.
Oh, livid. The conventions of medieval warfare usually dictated that if a garrison forced a costly siege and refused to yield before the walls were battered, they could expect no quarter.
So John ordered a gallows built, intending to hang the entire surviving garrison, starting with the nobles.
However, one of his own captains, a mercenary leader named Savary de Mauleon, intervened with a crucial piece of military logic.
What was the argument that stopped a furious king from executing rebels who had just cost him weeks of time and a fortune in siege operations?
Savary pointed out that the war was far from over. If John executed men who had surrendered, he would set a grim, unbreakable precedent.
Because if the war continued, and John's own men were forced to surrender a castle later on, the rebels would show them no mercy in return.
Right, it would turn a political rebellion into a war of total annihilation. By hanging the barons, John would be signing the death warrants of his own captains in the future.
It is a stark reminder of the cold, pragmatic calculations of medieval warfare.
Mercy is not granted out of the goodness of the heart. It is an insurance policy for tomorrow's battles.
And persuaded by this logic, John exercised a very calculated restraint.
The rebel barons, including William d'Aubigny, were heavily fettered and imprisoned in various royal castles to be held for ransom.
Only one man was executed, a young bowman who had previously served John and was viewed as a direct traitor to his personal oath.
John's victory at Rochester was a severe blow to the rebels. It pinned the remaining baronial forces down in London and gave John the strategic momentum.
He divided his forces, sending one army under his half-brother to secure East Anglia, while he marched north to ravage the estates of the northern barons.
The rebel cause was on the verge of total collapse.
So faced with complete defeat, their lands burning and the king closing in, the barons made a desperate, unprecedented geopolitical move.
They looked directly across the channel and sent an invitation to Prince Louis of France.
The son of King Philip II, They offered him the English throne.
which was an extraordinary escalation.
Louis had a tenuous legal claim to the throne through his wife, right? Blanche of Castile, who was King John's niece.
But legality was secondary to military necessity. The barons were shopping for a new king.
They needed a leader with an army, a fleet, siege engines, and the prestige to counter John.
And despite warnings from his own father, King Philip, who thought the venture was too risky and the direct threat of excommunication from the Pope, Louis accepted the offer.
This brings us to the forgotten French invasion of 1216.
In May of that year, Louis set sail with an armada of roughly 700 ships.
King John attempts to assemble a naval force to intercept him, but pure chance intervenes.
The severe storm disperses John's fleet, and Louis lands unopposed on the coast of Kent.
The impact was immediate and dramatic.
As Louis marched toward London, John, recognizing his strategic disadvantage and fearing his mercenary army would desert him if he faced a set-piece battle against a French prince, retreated westward.
So Louis entered London without facing significant resistance.
The rebel barons, along with the citizens of London, welcomed him openly,
He was proclaimed the King of England at St. Paul's Cathedral.
though he never received a formal coronation because the Archbishop of Canterbury was not present.
Consider the sheer scale of this crisis for a moment. You have a French prince occupying the capital city of England, being proclaimed king by the local aristocracy, while the actual English monarch is on the run in the west.
The momentum shifted so heavily that even King Alexander II of Scotland marched all the way down the length of the country to Dover to pay homage to Louis and recognize him as the sovereign.
By the summer of 1216, Louis controlled roughly half of the English kingdom.
Yet, Louis's campaign faced a formidable obstacle on the southern coast: Dover Castle.
King Philip of France had actually mocked Louis for attempting to conquer England without first securing Dover.
Dover was the key port connecting England to the continent. It was the gateway for supplies and reinforcements.
And the castle was held by Hubert de Burgh.
A veteran warrior, fiercely loyal to King John, commanding a well-supplied garrison.
The first siege of Dover is a testament to architectural and human resilience.
Louis took the high ground to the north of the castle and battered the Barbican, the heavily fortified outer gatehouse designed to protect the main entrance.
His miners successfully undermined the eastern tower, bringing it down, very much like what happened at Rochester.
But Hubert de Burgh's men responded with incredible speed and discipline.
As the French assault forces tried to climb the rubble of the collapsed tower, the English defenders fought them back in brutal hand-to-hand combat.
Under heavy fire, they managed to plug the breach in the stone wall, using giant wooden timbers, palisades, and whatever rubble they could stack.
So Louis spent 3 grueling months besieging Dover, tying up a huge portion of his army and his resources, until he was forced to call a truce in October and retreat to London to secure his supply lines.
And just as the war settles into this grueling stalemate, a microscopic twist of fate completely rewrites the course of history.
While campaigning in the east of England in October 1216, King John contracts dysentery.
He manages to reach Newark Castle in Nottinghamshire, but on October 18, 1216, he dies.
John's death entirely altered the political landscape overnight.
The rebel barons had started this war specifically to depose John.
Right, his tyranny, his extortion, his personal cruelty, that was the glue holding the rebel alliance together.
Now John was dead, and his heir, Henry III, was a 9-year-old boy. The immediate threat of John's tyranny vanished.
But the royalist cause is in dire straits. You have a 9-year-old king, a country half occupied by a French prince, and a treasury depleted by war.
The loyalist barons rush young Henry to Gloucester Abbey. Because Louis held London and Westminster, where coronations traditionally take place, they hastily crowned the boy in Gloucester.
They did not even have the royal regalia. They used a simple gold necklace belonging to his mother instead of the royal crown.
Which had allegedly been lost when John's baggage train sank in the quicksands of the Wash estuary days earlier.
And to manage this catastrophic situation, they appoint a man named William Marshal as the protector of the king and regent of the kingdom.
We must delve into William Marshal's background, because his presence, his sheer reputation, is the deciding factor in the survival of the English monarchy.
Marshal was essentially a living legend in medieval Europe, right?
He was. He was a younger son with no inheritance who built an empire on his own martial skill.
He was knighted back in 1166.
In 1168, he survived a brutal ambush by a rebellious lord while defending Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine.
He was wounded in the thigh, captured, and held for ransom.
And Eleanor paid his ransom, which launched his career at court. He spent years on the tournament circuit.
which at the time were essentially violent mock battles fought across miles of countryside.
Right. He famously claimed to have bested over 500 knights in his career, earning vast wealth from their captured horses and armor.
He had served 4 generations of the Plantagenet dynasty: Henry II, Henry the Young King, Richard the Lionheart, and King John.
In fact, back in 1189, during a rebellion, Marshall found himself facing down Richard the Lionheart in a skirmish.
And Marshall actually unhorsed Richard, sparing the prince's life but killing his horse to prove a point.
He was universally respected, even by his enemies, for his unwavering loyalty and chivalric code.
But Marshall is now roughly 70 years old. Why would he take on the impossible task of serving a 9-year-old boy when the war is all but lost and a French prince controls the capital?
Well, Marshall understood the deeply entrenched concepts of feudal loyalty and honor. He viewed it as his sacred duty to protect the legitimate heir.
But beyond his chivalry, Marshall was an astute tactician.
He recognized a profound political vulnerability in Louis's position.
And on November 12, 1216, less than a month after John's death, Marshall executed a brilliant piece of political warfare.
He reissued the Magna Carta in the young King Henry's name.
But there was a catch, right? He reissued it with several clauses omitted, most notably the inflammatory clause 61.
The security clause that established the Committee of 25 Barons and allowed for legal rebellion.
Precisely. By voluntarily adopting the core demands of the rebels, the guarantees of due process, the protection of inheritances, the limits on taxation, Marshall completely stripped the rebellious barons of their moral justification for fighting.
He effectively broadcasted a message to the rebels. The tyrant you hated is dead. The boy king guarantees your rights and your property.
Why are you still fighting alongside a foreign prince who inevitably intends to take your English lands and redistribute them to his own French followers?
It was a masterstroke of diplomacy.
Slowly but surely, the rebel barons began to realize that a 9-year-old English king whose regent respected the Magna Carta was a much better prospect than a French prince who might supplant them.
Defections began to occur. The psychological tide of loyalty started to turn, but the ultimate deciding factor still had to be settled on the battlefield.
And the war continued into 1217.
Louis returned briefly to France to gather reinforcements, suffering ambushes on his way to the coast by loyalist guerrillas in the forests of the Weald.
Upon his return to England, he made a strategic error. He divided his forces.
He sent a large contingent north to besiege Lincoln Castle, while he personally returned to the south coast to resume the grueling siege of Dover.
This division of forces presented William Marshall with a critical opportunity.
Which leads us to the decisive military encounters that ended the war, starting with the Second Battle of Lincoln on May 20, 1217.
Marshall, despite his advanced age, personally led a relief force to break the French siege at Lincoln.
The topography of Lincoln is important here. The city is built on a steep hill.
The French and rebel forces held the city itself, the streets, and the houses,
while a loyalist garrison, commanded by a fierce castellan named Nicolas de la Haye, held out desperately inside the castle at the top of the hill.
Marshall's forces arrived and executed a highly coordinated, multi-pronged assault.
A portion of his army attacked the west gate of the city to create a diversion and draw the French defenders,
while crossbowmen systematically cleared rubble from a blocked side gate near the castle.
And once that side gate was clear and open, Marshall's heavy cavalry poured directly into the narrow city streets.
The accounts describe fierce claustrophobic fighting around the North Gate and the area right outside the magnificent Lincoln Cathedral.
In the chaos of this urban cavalry melee, a defining moment occurred.
The French commander, Count Thomas of Perche, was struck by a spear or a sword thrust straight through the eye slit of his helmet and killed instantly on the cobblestones.
The death of their commander shattered the morale of the French and rebel forces. We have to understand the psychology of medieval combat.
Armies were held together by personal oaths to their commanders.
Right, the commander was the figurehead, the literal standard bearer. When Count Thomas fell, the chain of command evaporated.
The French retreat quickly turned into a chaotic rout. As they tried to flee down the steep hill through the narrow southern gates of the city, they became trapped in a severe bottleneck.
Marshall's men captured numerous high-ranking rebel barons, including Robert Fitzwalter,
the very man who had initially corresponded with the French officials over his Norman lands years earlier.
Yes, the victory at Lincoln broke the rebel army in the north.
They called it the Fair of Lincoln because of the immense amount of loot the Royalists took from the captured rebel baggage train.
But Louis was still a severe threat in the south. He was waiting for a vast fleet of reinforcements sent by his wife, Blanche of Castile.
who was tirelessly organizing support in France.
This sets the stage for the naval Battle of Sandwich in August 1217.
The French reinforcement fleet was commanded by a highly notorious figure, Eustace the Monk.
His background is fascinating. He was a former cleric from Boulogne who abandoned his vows to demand justice for his murdered father.
He eventually became an incredibly successful and feared mercenary pirate in the English Channel.
There were even popular legends that he practiced black magic. He had actually served King John for a time before defecting to the French.
And he was bringing critical supplies, siege engines, horses, and fresh troops across the Channel to reinforce Louis.
But Hubert de Burgh, the same commander who had so stubbornly held Dover Castle, realized that if those reinforcements landed, the war would drag on for years.
He assembled an English fleet from the Cinque Ports to intercept them. They engaged the French off the coast of Sandwich.
And here we see some truly ingenious naval tactics. The English ships intentionally maneuvered to windward, meaning they positioned themselves so the wind was blowing from them toward the French fleet.
Once in position, the English threw pots of pulverized lime dust into the air.
This was quicklime, calcium oxide. When it mixes with moisture, such as the tears in a person's eyes or sweat on their skin, it reacts violently,
causing severe chemical burns. The wind carried this blinding, burning powder straight into the faces of the French sailors and soldiers.
Blinded and in agony, the French were unable to defend themselves as the English ships rammed and boarded them.
The English captured the heavily laden French flagship. They scoured the vessel and found Eustace the Monk hiding down in the bilge of the ship.
They dragged him onto the deck. Because of his reputation as a pirate, his history of shifting loyalties, and his status as a traitor to the English crown, they offered him no quarter and demanded no ransom.
He was summarily executed, beheaded right on the deck of his own ship, and his head was paraded on a pike as a warning.
The destruction of this fleet was the final nail in the coffin for Louis's campaign.
Trapped in England, cut off from all French resupply, and watching his English allies abandon him day by day to make peace with William Marshal, Prince Louis had no choice but to negotiate a formal surrender.
This brings us to the Treaty of Lambeth, signed on September 11, 1217.
William Marshal, operating from a position of absolute strength following the victories at Lincoln and Sandwich, offered terms that were surprisingly moderate.
They were designed not to punish, but to ensure Louis left quickly and peacefully, ending the war without further bloodshed.
Louis formally renounced his claim to the English throne.
Furthermore, he explicitly agreed that he had never been the legitimate king, erasing his brief reign from the official historical record, which is why we do not count a King Louis I of England today.
In return, he was paid 10,000 marks to cover his expenses and expedite his departure.
Let us contextualize that number. 10,000 marks. A mark was a unit of account equal to 2/3 of a pound sterling.
In the medieval economy, 10,000 marks was a staggering sum, roughly equivalent to half of the English crown's total annual revenue.
It was essentially an enormous bribe to get an invading army off their lawn.
And as part of the treaty, the rebel barons were granted a general amnesty and allowed to reclaim their lands if they swore fealty to young King Henry.
But the most profound legacy of the First Barons' War and the resulting Treaty of Lambeth was the survival and integration of the Magna Carta into the fabric of governance.
A document that had started as a failed peace treaty, annulled by the Pope and ignored by the King, was resurrected by William Marshal as a tool of political survival.
It was reborn from the ashes of a civil war.
It was reissued again in 1217 alongside a separate charter of the forest.
And later reissued in 1225 by Henry III when he came of age and assumed full control of the government.
It was eventually placed at the very beginning of England's first roll of statutes in 1297 by Edward I. It became the bedrock of English law.
The long-term effects on global legal thought are immeasurable. The Charter established the principle of proportional punishment, that a fine should fit the severity of the offense and not completely deprive a person of their livelihood or their tools of trade.
It mandated institutional respectability, demanding that royal officials actually know the law and act according to it, rather than just imposing the king's arbitrary will.
Most importantly, it established the fundamental idea that the sovereign is not above the law, but is subject to it. It drew a line in the sand that defined the limits of executive power.
There is a profound irony here. We look back at the Magna Carta today as this gleaming beacon of democratic rights, the foundational text for modern justice.
Yet it is filled with clauses about standardizing the width of dyed cloth and removing fish weirs from the River Thames.
It was drafted by self-interested feudal lords trying to protect their inheritance fees and their control over local trade.
It was weaponized by a 70-year-old knight to win a civil war for a 9-year-old boy.
It proves that human progress is rarely a straight, logical line drawn on a pristine map. It is born from chaos, from messy compromises, and from sheer gritty survival.
History is not an inevitable march of progress. It is contingent upon 1,000 fragile variables.
If the barons had not chosen to rebel against John's specific, personal brand of tyranny, the concept of distraining a king might never have been written down.
If William Marshall had decided to retire instead of serving a 9-year-old boy, the Plantagenet dynasty would likely have fallen, and the political map of Europe would look entirely different today.
Which leaves us with a final thought to ponder. Think about how heavily the rule of law that governs your life today hinged on pure, unpredictable chance.
If a severe storm had not scattered King John's fleet, Prince Louis might never have landed in Kent, and the French invasion would have failed before it started.
If a single microscopic bacterium had not given King John dysentery in the autumn of 1216, he might have survived to defeat the rebels.
The Magna Carta would have been thrown into the dustbin of history as a failed, annulled rebellion.
England might very well have been absorbed as a vassal state into the Kingdom of France. The quiet room where contracts are safely signed today only exists because 800 years ago, the right people survived the mud, the disease, and the blood.
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.